Some names and details in this story have been changed for the purpose of anonymity and confidentiality. Not all photos were taken at the scene. On August 19th, 2018, at 16 hours and 15 minutes, the silence of the remote shadow of the Eagle Canyon was broken by an urgent call on the radio. Two geologists who were exploring rocks in the park's dead zone reported a gruesome discovery. In a narrow stone crevice, safely hidden from search helicopters by an overhanging eave, lay the mummified body of a man. The rangers who arrived at the scene immediately recognized the remains of professional equipment, and documents in a sealed container confirmed the worst guesses. It was Carlos Spencer. Every park employee knew his name. Exactly 3 years ago, on June 12, 2015, this experienced guide led a group of 5 tourists deep into the plateau. They successfully passed the checkpoints, sent photos of their happy faces against the rocks, and then disappeared without a trace, as if they had vanished into the hot Arizona air. For years, the investigation considered it a tragic water accident, but the discovery of the body changed everything. Characteristic damage to the skull indicated that Carlos Spencer did not fall off a cliff and die of dehydration. He was killed by a blunt force trauma to the back of the head, and his body was deliberately hidden in this stone grave 15 miles from the hiking trail. Now it became clear that the canyon was not an accident, but a brutal crime, the witnesses of which had disappeared. On June 12, 2015, at 5:30 in the morning, the parking lot at the beginning of the South Kaibab Trail looked deceptively calm. The sun had not yet risen over the eastern rim of the canyon, and the deep canyon was filled with cold, blue shadows. The thermometer at the ranger station read 16 degrees Celsius, but the dry Arizona air was already promising a sweltering heat by midday. A group of 6 people stood near the information booth. They were led by 32-year-old Carlos Spencer, a lead guide for the Echo Canyon Company. Surveillance footage later seized by the investigation showed him methodically checking the straps of his charge's backpacks. His movements were clear and professional. Carlos had spent half his life in these rocks and knew every turn of the trail. That morning, he looked focused, but calm. 5 tourists were hiking under his guidance. Mark Daniels, a 40-year-old architect from Ohio, and his wife Susan, who had been preparing for this trip for over 6 months. 50-year-old businessman from California, Robert Hayes, and his 18-year-old son, Danny, for whom the descent was to be a test of endurance. The group was rounded out by 30-year-old journalist Olivia Clark. They were all dressed in high-quality trekking gear and carried the recommended water supply of 4 liters per person. At 6:15, the group crossed the starting line and began their descent. The route included a crossing to the Colorado River with an overnight stay at Bright Angel Campground and a return climb the next day. It was a standard, though physically demanding route. A witness, the driver of a tourist shuttle that dropped off passengers nearby, later noted in the report that he heard laughter and lively conversations among the group members. The first hours of the descent went without deviations from the schedule. At 10:45, Carlos Spencer's satellite messenger transmitted a signal from a point known as Skeleton Point. It was an intermediate platform on a slope with a panoramic view of the riverbed. Along with the coordinates, the company's office received a photo. It showed 5 tourists and a guide posing against the backdrop of red rocks. They looked tired, but happy. This image was the last documentary evidence that the group was complete and safe. At 13 hours and 20 minutes, the group reached the bottom of the canyon. The ranger at the Phantom Ranch post recorded their passage across the suspension bridge over the Colorado River. The visitor logbook contains an entry made in Carlos Spencer's handwriting. Group of 6, condition satisfactory, heading to Bright Angel Campground. The temperature at the bottom of the gorge at that moment reached 42 degrees Celsius. The heat was exhausting, and the tourists moved slowly, saving their energy. The night at the campsite was quiet. Other tourists who spent the night nearby later told investigators that they saw the tents of Spencer's group. They were set up according to the rules, and no fires were lit. No one heard any quarrels or screams. It seemed to be a normal overnight stay before a hard climb. The problems began on the morning of June 14th. According to the plan, the group was supposed to start climbing at 5 in the morning to overcome the most difficult part of the trail before the midday heat. At 12 o'clock in the afternoon, they were to check in at the Indian Garden checkpoint, located halfway to the summit. When no word came from the group at 14:00, the park manager tried to contact Carlos by radio. The airwaves were silent. Attempts to call him via satellite phone also failed. At 14 hours and 30 minutes, the ranger on duty was ordered to go down to Bright Angel Campground to check it out. What he saw raised more questions than answers. The parking lot was empty. The sand retained clear rectangular tent marks, indicating that the camp had been folded, but it had been done with suspicious care. Not a single wrapper or forgotten water bottle had been left behind. It looked as if the group had gathered in an organized manner and hit the road. However, not a single camera on the trails leading up the mountain recorded their passage. At 17 o'clock on the same day, the alarm was sounded. A search helicopter was sent into the air, and ground teams began combing the Colorado River shoreline. The rescuers assumed that the group might have decided to swim before leaving, and that a tragedy had occurred on the water. The first clue came just before sunset. One of the volunteers, moving upstream along the shore, spotted a bright object in a small backwater, 2 miles from the campsite. It was a blue hiking backpack. It was caught in a driftwood strap and half submerged in the water. When the backpack was pulled ashore, it turned out that it belonged to Susan Daniels. Inside were documents, a tablet, and spare clothes. The items were wet but undamaged. However, one detail made the experienced rangers shudder. The backpack was zipped up, and the waist belt was tightened as if it had just been removed. Usually, when a person falls into the water, he tries to dump the load by unfastening the fasteners in a panic. Here, it looked as if the backpack had been carefully placed in the water, or its owner had no way to fight for her life. On June 15, 2015, the search operation in the Grand Canyon took on an unprecedented scale. The area around the Bright Angel campsite turned into a war zone, where the enemy was not only time, but also the ruthless landscape. The temperature in the shade reached 43 degrees Celsius. The air was constantly filled with the humming of 2 National Guard helicopters, which were scanning every meter of the Colorado River's shoreline at low altitude. 6 K-9 teams were working on the ground. The dogs, trained to search for both living people and bodies, kept losing track on the hot rocks. The water in the river was muddy, making it difficult for divers who risked their lives in the raging currents to check underwater grottos and log jams. The park's management brought in elite teams of climbers to inspect vertical crevices that could not be reached by the air. On the third day of the search, June 16th, hope for a quick solution to the mystery flared up with renewed vigor. A group of climbers descending the rocks near the Black Bridge, a suspension bridge over the river located a mile from the campsite, noticed a glow on the rocks. It was an expensive DSLR camera with a broken lens. The serial number confirmed that the equipment belonged to Robert Hayes, a businessman from California. The camera was lying on a rock ledge as if it had fallen from a great height. Experts tried to recover the data from the damaged memory card, hoping to see the last moments of the group's life, but the storage medium was physically destroyed by the impact. The discovery only confused the investigation. Susan Daniels' backpack was found upstream, while Hayes' camera was found downstream. This contradicted the logic of a single route. The group seemed to be scattered across the canyon. Weeks passed, and no new evidence appeared. The version of a massive water accident was becoming less and less convincing. The water level in the Colorado was average. The current was predictable. According to the park's statistics, the river usually gives up bodies within 7 to 10 days. But this time, the water was silent. The version of poisoning by poor quality food or water also did not explain the disappearance of the bodies and equipment. Investigators even considered the option of staging, but financial checks of the families of the missing did not reveal any suspicious motives. On July 1, 2015, the active phase of the search was officially curtailed. The case became a cold case. Photos of the missing tourists on information boards began to fade in the Arizona sun. Relatives hired private detectives and psychics, but the canyon kept it secret. The story of Carlos Spencer's group turned into another creepy legend that scared newcomers around night campfires. 3 years have passed. On August 19, 2018, at about 16 o'clock, the silence in a completely different part of the park was broken by the footsteps of 2 people. They were amateur geologists who had received a special permit to explore rocks in a remote side canyon called the Shadow of the Eagle. This site is located 15 miles west of the Bright Angel hiking trail. It is a wild, waterless area where rarely a human foot sets foot, and rangers patrol it only from the air once a month. One of the geologists climbing up the canyon wall noticed an unnatural color in a narrow vertical crevice hidden from the sky by a massive stone cornice. As he got closer, he realized that it was not a mineral. It was fabric. A brightly colored synthetic material that had turned into dirty rags over the years, but still retained the structure of expensive trekking clothes. In a narrow niche, wedged between the stones, lay a partially mummified human skeleton. The dry desert air and protection from direct sunlight slowed down the decomposition process. The body lay in an unnatural position, as if it had been thrown there by force. Next to the remains was a professional climbing belt with rust-covered carabiners and a small waterproof plastic container, which is usually used by guides to store documents and matches. The geologists did not dare to touch the body, but they opened the container, which was lying separately. Inside, protected from time and the elements, was an Arizona driver's license. The photo showed the familiar face of the man they had been searching for 1,060 days. Carlos Spencer. It took almost a day for the investigative team to arrive and evacuate the remains. The body was taken to the Coconino County Medical Examiner's office. What was supposed to be the final point in the story of a tragic accident suddenly turned into the beginning of a criminal investigation. The examination conducted on August 21st, 2018, shocked the detectives. The condition of the bones of the legs and spine indicated that Carlos Spencer had not fallen from a great height. No compression fractures characteristic of a fall were found. Instead, the victim's skull told a completely different story. An oval-shaped, depressed fracture with divergent cracks was found in the back of the skull. The nature of the damage clearly indicated a strong, purposeful blow with a heavy, blunt object. The angle of the blow indicated that the attacker was from behind and that the victim was probably kneeling or sitting at the time. The natural conditions of the cave preserved the main clue. It was not dehydration, a fall, or a snakebite. The experienced guide, who knew these places better than anyone, was executed in cold blood in the middle of the desert. Friends, before we continue to unravel this tangle of mysteries, I ask you to support the channel. Subscribe, click on the bell, like this video, and leave any comment. Your activity is a signal to YouTube's algorithms to promote this content. This is the only way for more people to see this story, and together we will get closer to the truth. Thank you to everyone who stays with us. On August 23, 2018, 2 days after the shocking medical examiner's conclusion about the murder, the status of the investigation changed. It was no longer an accident case, but a manhunt for a killer. Coconino County police detectives obtained warrants for a full background check on Carlos Spencer. They needed to understand who would want to kill a man who was considered the soul of the company and a top-notch professional. On the surface, Carlos's life looked perfect. He lived in the city of Flagstaff, in a neat house overlooking a walnut grove. His neighbors described him as a friendly, if somewhat reserved man who lived alone and spent all his free time training. His colleagues at Canyon Echo called him an Iron Man. He never complained of fatigue, always took extra shifts, and had an impeccable reputation among his clients. The man seemed to have no enemies. However, when police financial analysts gained access to his bank accounts and credit history, the glossy picture of a successful tour guide instantly crumbled. Behind the facade of stability was an abyss of despair. Carlos Spencer was a bankrupt teetering on the edge of an abyss. The auditor's report, dated August 25, 2018, revealed the true extent of the disaster. The house in Flagstaff was mortgaged, and Carlos was 4 months behind on his mortgage payments. The bank had already sent him an eviction notice. His heavy-duty pickup truck, his pride and joy, was also purchased on credit, and he hadn't paid for it since February 2015. Even his professional equipment, tents, sleeping bags, navigators, was purchased with credit cards that had been completely maxed out. But where did the money go? Carlos earned a decent salary, well above the market average. The answer was found in his transaction statements. For 2 years, the man had been transferring huge sums to offshore bookmaker accounts. Carlos Spencer was a pathological gambler. He placed bets on everything from the results of football matches in Europe to horse racing in Hong Kong. The browser history on his seized home laptop showed that he spent his nights on online casino sites. One night in March 2015, he lost $7,000 in 4 hours. This financial hole was only a piece of the puzzle. Detectives found documents that gave the case a completely different color. 6 months before the fatal trip, in January of 2015, Carlos had taken out 3 separate life insurance policies with 3 different insurance companies. It was a classic scheme to avoid attracting the attention of the insurer's security services. The terms of the contracts were specific. Each policy provided for a double payout if the insured's death occurred as a result of an accident while performing professional duties. The total amount of payments under the 3 policies was $1,500,000. It was a huge amount of money that could solve any problem. Only one person was listed as the beneficiary in all the documents: his younger sister, 27-year-old Elena Spencer. When the detectives checked her information, Carlos's motive became clear and tragic. Elena suffered from a rare genetic lung disease that was progressing. She needed complex experimental therapy that was not covered by regular insurance. The cost of the treatment and subsequent rehabilitation was hundreds of thousands of dollars. Medical bills found in Carlos's desk drawer showed that he was paying for his sister's supportive care out of his own pocket, taking money from credit cards. Investigators were faced with a difficult dilemma. Everything indicated that Carlos Spencer was preparing a large-scale scam. Debts, gambling addiction, his sister's terminal illness, and fresh insurance policies with huge payouts are classic motives for faking one's own death. The plan might have looked like this: disappear into a canyon, leave evidence of his death, let his sister get the money, and start life from scratch somewhere in Mexico. But this theory was shattered by one indisputable fact. Carlos's body was real. He was found dead, with a fractured skull, hidden in a crevasse so that no one would find him. If he was planning a staged murder, why would someone kill him? And the most important question that haunted the detectives was, what role did the 5 tourists play in this plan? Why would a guide planning to disappear or die for insurance take witnesses with him? Why did they, people who had nothing to do with his debts and problems, disappear? Investigators began to suspect that Carlos was not the victim of a random attack. Perhaps he was the initiator of something terrible that had gotten out of hand. On August 26, while reviewing the cloud storage of data from Carlos's phone, police cyber experts noticed strange activity the week before the hike. The call log was nearly clean, but metadata analysis showed that Carlos had been using an encrypted messenger to communicate with the same caller. The last message was sent 8 hours before the group left for the route. It consisted of one word: ready. On August 27, 2018, the Carlos Spencer investigation moved from the hot rocks of the Grand Canyon to the cool, monitor-lit office of the Flagstaff Police Department's cybercrime unit. The detectives realized that while physical evidence had been destroyed by time in the desert, digital traces could survive forever. Carlos Spencer could have erased the history on his laptop, but he did not take into account that modern technology creates invisible backups in the cloud that become posthumous witnesses to a secret life. The experts obtained a court order to access all the cloud accounts of the deceased guide. What they saw resembled a dive into the mind of a person methodically preparing for a crime. The history of search queries recovered from the server, starting in March 2015, was radically different from the interests of an ordinary tourist or professional guide. Instead of weather forecasts or flora descriptions, Carlos was interested in chemistry. Between April 10th and April 20th, 2015, he entered queries related to potent sedatives dozens of times. He was interested in specific substances: ketamine, chloroform, and barbiturates. But the most frightening thing was not the interest in medicines, but the specificity of the questions. Dosage for an adult male weighing 90 kilograms. Time of action when dissolved in water. Overdose symptoms resembling heat stroke. It didn't look like preparation for suicide. It looked like planning to neutralize a group of people. Investigators compared the dates of the requests with Spencer's work schedule and realized that he had been preparing this plan for months, waiting for the perfect group of tourists. In addition to pharmacology, Carlos studied geography, but not the kind depicted in travel brochures. In his saved maps, he found detailed topographical plans of the Coconino Plateau, including sectors closed to the public. He was interested in old mines, abandoned smugglers' trails, and caves not marked on official maps. He paid special attention to the area where his body would be found 3 years later, the shadow of the Eagle Canyon. This proved that the place of his death was not accidental. He knew about this gorge long before he got there. The next piece of the puzzle was financial activity. While checking bank statements, detectives came across a transaction that stood out from the general picture of debts and online bets. On May 15, 2015, exactly 1 month before the fatal hike, Carlos Spencer withdrew $5,000 in cash from his account. The transaction was made at an ATM on the outskirts of Phoenix, in a neighborhood with a bad reputation, 200 miles from his home. The security cameras were not working that day, but the fact that a person who had no way to pay his mortgage was withdrawing such a sum looked suspicious. The money did not go to pay off the loans. It disappeared. The investigation assumed that it was a payment for services that could not be made through a bank. It was a fee for complicity. The main find was waiting for the investigators in the contacts and calls synchronization section. Carlos was careful. He used disposable SIM cards and secure messengers. However, the automatic backup system saved the call log from a week before he disappeared, which he forgot to delete from the cloud. Among the dozens of business numbers, there was one that was not recorded in the phone book. The subscriber was contacted only at night. The last call, lasting 4 minutes, was recorded on June 8, 2015. The police made a request to the mobile operator to identify the owner of the number. The answer came on August 30th. The number was registered to a straw man, but the cell tower tie-in led police to a specific location, an old trailer park south of the city of Williams. The operatives pulled up the archives and found out that the phone was used by a 45-year-old Jack Morrison, known in criminal circles as The Rock. Morrison's record was impressive. In the past, he had served 7 years for armed robbery of a pharmacy and assault on a police officer. After his release, he hadn't officially worked anywhere, but local rangers knew him as a poacher who illegally hunted rare animals in protected areas. Morrison knew the desert better than any guide. He knew how to disappear and reappear unnoticed. It was rumored that for the right price, he could get anything or transport anyone across state lines, bypassing patrols. The connection between Carlos Spencer, an impeccable guide, and Jack Morrison, a repeat offender, changed everything. This was no longer a story about a desperate loner who wanted to fake his death for insurance. It was a conspiracy. $5,000 in cash probably passed from Carlos's hands to Morrison's. Chemicals, maps of the hideouts, and a hired gun with a criminal record all pointed to the fact that not just a scam was being prepared in the canyon, but a complex kidnapping or elimination operation. The detective in charge of the case looked at Morrison's photo on the monitor. A hard look, a scar on his chin, a tattoo on his neck. This man was the complete opposite of the intelligent Carlos. What could have united them? And most importantly, where was Jack Morrison in the days when the group disappeared? The analysis of the repeat offender's phone movements showed that on June 12 and 13, 2015, his device was turned off. He disappeared from the radar at the same time as the group. But on June 15th, when the search began, his phone reappeared online, and a signal was recorded just 30 miles from the southern edge of the canyon. On September 1st, 2018, at 4:30 in the morning, the silence on the outskirts of the town of Williams was broken by the rumble of heavy machinery. The Arizona State Police Special Response Team, reinforced by FBI agents, surrounded an old ranch deep in the pine forest. This was the residence of Jack Morrison, the man whose phone number became the thread that led to the unraveling of the disappearance of Carlos Spencer's group. The sting operation lasted less than 3 minutes. Morrison, who was awakened by stun grenades, did not have time to get to his weapon. During the search of his trailer, unregistered hunting rifles, topographic maps of closed sectors of the Grand Canyon, and a significant amount of cash in small bills were found. But the main prey of the investigation was Jack the Rock Morrison himself. The suspect remained silent for the first 6 hours of interrogation. He sat in the interrogation room, staring at one point, and ignored the detective's questions. The situation changed when the investigator put on the table photos from the scene of Carlos Spencer's body and billing results linking their phones. The detective informed Morrison that he faced the death penalty for complicity in the murder of 6 people. The Rock turned pale. He realized that his silence would be interpreted as an admission of guilt in organizing the massacre. At 16 hours and 15 minutes, Jack Morrison asked for water and agreed to testify on video. His story turned the police's understanding of what happened in the canyon 3 years ago upside down. According to the repeat offender, Carlos Spencer was not a victim of blackmail. He was the architect of a crime so audacious that it was hard to believe. The plan developed by the guy did not involve faking his death. It was a kidnapping. Carlos hired Morrison and his partner, whose name has not yet been disclosed by the investigation, to do the dirty work. The scenario was supposed to take place on the night of June 12 to 13, 2015, at the Bright Angel campground. According to Morrison's testimony, Carlos planned to use his knowledge of customer confidence. During dinner around the campfire, he was going to mix a powerful sedative into tea or water, the same one that was found in his browser history. The hope was that after a difficult crossing, the tired tourists would not notice the foreign flavor. When the group would have lost consciousness, Morrison and his partner were to step in. They were to descend into the canyon along the old smugglers' trails, which are not marked on maps and are not used by rangers. They prepared 4 hardy mules to transport the bodies. The plan was to take the unconscious tourists out of the tourist area at night, while the campers were sleeping. The end point of the route was to be a pre-prepared cave in one of the remote side canyons where the captives were to be held. The motive was purely financial, but much more cynical than just an insurance scam. Carlos hoped to gain access to the bank accounts of wealthy clients, forcing them to transfer funds under the influence of drugs, or to demand a ransom from relatives for rescuing those lost in the desert. The guide himself was supposed to stay in the camp, playing the role of a victim of an attack by unknown persons, or a miraculously surviving witness who would lead rescuers on a false trail. However, as Morrison claimed, that night, everything did not go according to plan. He, his partner, and the mules waited at the agreed-upon spot on a flat rock outcropping a mile from Bright Angel campground. They arrived there at 1 a.m. on June 13th. They had a clear signal, 3 long flashes of a powerful lantern from the camp. This was supposed to mean that everyone was asleep and the way was clear. "We waited until dawn," Morrison said during interrogation, nervously crumpling a paper cup. "We saw the lights below, heard the sound of the river. but there was no signal. It was dark. Not a single flash. At 4 in the morning, when the sky began to turn gray, Morrison decided to retreat. The risk of being seen by rangers with mules on the forbidden trail was too great. They returned to the ranch, confident that Carlos had gotten scared at the last minute or failed to add the drug unnoticed. Morrison claimed that he never saw Carlos again or received any messages from him. When the news reported the disappearance of the entire group a few days later, he thought that the guide had decided to act on his own or had run away with the client's money. The discovery of his partner's body came as much as a shock to him as it did to the police. Detectives checked Morrison's alibi. CCTV footage from a gas station in Williams confirmed that his pickup truck was filling up at 7 o'clock in the morning on June 13th. This made it physically impossible for him to be at the crime scene at the time the team was supposed to go upstairs. He was telling the truth. He was not there when it happened. But this admission created an even more frightening mystery. If the kidnapping plan failed and the accomplices left without touching the tourists, what happened that night? Why didn't Carlos send a signal? An examination of the guide's body showed the presence of the same sedative in his own bones. This meant that he had either taken it himself or was forced to. The investigators returned to the route map and realized that they had made a fatal mistake. The group had never spent the night at Bright Angel Campground. The tent marks were fake. The last confirmed location of the group was near the bridge, but no camera recorded them entering the campground itself. They had turned off the road earlier. On September 10th, 2018, 3 weeks after the discovery of Carlos Spencer's mummified body, a toxicology lab report landed on the desk of the Coconino County chief investigator. This 20-page document completely destroyed the previous version that the guide had been the victim of a hired killer or a greedy accomplice. The chemical analysis of the bone tissue revealed a high concentration of the same sedative that Carlos had been interested in on the internet months before the hike. But the most important thing was not the detection of the substance itself, but its amount and time of ingestion. The experts concluded that Carlos Spencer had taken the drug orally in dissolved form, about an hour before his death. It was not a forced administration through an injection during the struggle. He drank it himself. This discovery forced detectives to return to Jack Morrison's testimony and look at it from a different angle. If the rock was waiting downstairs and Carlos took a sedative upstairs, it means that the kidnapping scenario began to fall apart before nightfall. The investigative team remodeled the group's route using the latest billing data from the tourists' phones, which they managed to recover from cloud storage. What had previously been thought to be a system error or lack of coverage was now proof. The group never went down to the Colorado River that morning. The entry in the ranger's log at Phantom Ranch was wrong. In the height of the season, when hundreds of people in the same gear cross the bridge, visual identification is often inaccurate. The last real digital trail of the group did not end at the bottom of the canyon, but at a fork in the trails near the Indian Garden Oasis, located on the Tonto Plateau, 3,000 feet above the river. This radically changed the picture of the crime. Carlos Spencer was not leading them to a campsite. He was leading them into a trap. The reconstruction of the events, drawn up by FBI profilers, looked terrifyingly plausible. Carlos, using his authority and the trust of the group, probably suggested that they deviate from the standard route. He could have promised to show them a secret viewpoint overlooking the sunset, where ordinary tourists are not taken. This would explain why the group turned toward a wild, unmarked canyon where they would later find his body. It was there, in the shadow of overhanging rocks, away from prying eyes, that the tragedy unfolded. Investigators assumed that after a grueling hike, Carlos called a halt. He took out pre-prepared bottles of isotonic or vitamin cocktail with the drug already dissolved in them. His plan was simple: put the group to sleep here, in a secluded place, and then, faking panic, contact Morrison by radio to evacuate. The fact that he drank some of the mixture himself could have been part of the legend, so that when they were found, he would also have traces of poisoning in his blood, which would confirm the version of an external attack. Or he simply mixed up the bottles under stress. But something went wrong. Perhaps one of the tourists refused to drink the warm liquid. Maybe the dosage was wrong, and instead of instant sleep, the drug caused hallucinations or aggression. Or maybe Mark Daniels or Robert Hayes noticed the guide spiking the powder. In any case, trust gave way to suspicion, and suspicion to a desperate struggle for life. The nature of Carlos Spencer's skull injury was the key to understanding the ending of this scene. The medical examiner emphasized that the blow was not delivered by a professional. It was not a clear, calculated blow by the killer. It was a chaotic, panicked blow, struck with all the force of the first thing that came to hand. The shape of the wound perfectly matched the profile of a heavy granite stone, of which there are many on the plateau, or the tip of a trekking pole. Carlos Spencer was not a victim of a conspiracy. He was a victim of self-defense. The people he was planning to sell as a commodity realized that they were in mortal danger and fought back. They killed their leader in defense of themselves and their families. This version explained everything. The absence of Morrison at the scene, the strange location of the body, which they tried to hastily hide in the crevasse, and the disappearance of their belongings. The tourists, being in a state of shock, under the influence of heat, and possibly partially under the influence of a drug, realized that they had just killed a man in the middle of the desert. But this discovery brought investigators a new, even greater horror. If Carlos had died at the hands of tourists 3 years ago, it meant that 5 city dwellers, without a map, without communication, because the satellite phone was left with the guide or destroyed, were left alone in a maze of hot stone. They were frightened, disoriented, and probably believed that Carlos had accomplices who would come after them. They couldn't go back to the trail for fear of being chased. There was only one way left for them to run to nowhere, deep into the ruthless plateau, hoping to find another way out. On September 11th, 2018, the Coconino County Police Investigation Team found themselves facing the most tragic piece of this puzzle. The experts' findings on the death of Carlos Spencer turned the 5 missing tourists from victims of kidnapping into fugitives, cornered by their own fear. The FBI psychologists involved in the case modeled the group's behavior in those fateful minutes of June 2015. Imagine their condition. 5 civilians, exhausted by the heat, standing over the body of their guide in the middle of a desert. They have just realized that the man they trusted with their lives tried to poison them, and in a panic of self-defense, they killed him. There are only hot stones and silence around them. They have no map because Carlos was navigating. They have no communication because the satellite phone was probably damaged or hidden by the guide. And the worst part is that they are convinced that Spencer's accomplices may be nearby, whom he could have mentioned before his death or during the threats. The investigation concluded that the group had made a fatal decision not to wait in a place where potential killers could find them, but to flee. But where to? The Coconino Plateau in this sector is a real maze of deep, dry streams, sharp rocks, and canyons that look the same. Without knowledge of the area, an attempt to reach civilization directly was tantamount to suicide. On September 12, 2018, the search area was officially shifted. The rangers were no longer looking for tracks near the Colorado River. Now they were interested in a 10-mile radius around the cave in Eagle's Shadow Canyon. It was an area that even experienced climbers tried to avoid due to the difficult terrain and complete lack of water sources. The search operation lasted 2 weeks in extreme temperatures. The groups moved slowly, scanning the cracks in the ground meter by meter. On September 26, 2018, at 10:45, a dog handler with a search dog gave a signal on the radio. The dog began barking at the edge of a deep ravine 7 miles northeast of where Carlos died. As the rescuers descended to the bottom of the dry channel using ropes, they saw a scene that silenced them. Under the cover of a small bush, trying to hide from the scorching sun, were human remains. It was the skeleton of a young man. Next to him were things that allowed for instant identification. Broken sunglasses and an empty plastic water bottle twisted as if someone was trying to squeeze the last drop of moisture out of it. The dental records we found confirmed that he was 18-year-old Danny Hayes, the son of a California businessman. He was the youngest and physically strongest member of the group, but the desert does not discount age. The boy's body was in a fetal position, which is a characteristic sign of terminal exhaustion. The forensic medical report, signed on September 28, was dry and horrifying. The cause of death was acute dehydration and hyperthermia, heat stroke. Danny Hayes did not die at the hands of bandits. He died of thirst while wandering through the scorching heat in search of salvation. Experts have established the approximate time of death, June 17th or 18th, 2015. This meant that the boy was alive for 3 or 4 days after his disappearance. While the helicopters were circling the river, he was dying in a ravine on the plateau, a few miles from the search area, unable to send a signal. An analysis of the tracks around the site, which were miraculously preserved under a layer of dust, allowed us to partially restore the chronology of the group's breakup. No traces of the other 4 tourists were found near Danny's body. This indicated that at some point in desperation, they had split up. Perhaps Danny, as the youngest, volunteered to go on a reconnaissance to find water or an exit to the trail and was unable to return. Or the group may have scattered in panic even earlier, losing visual contact with each other in the maze of rocks. The discovery of Danny Hayes' body finally buried the theory that the tourists had been taken out of the country or held captive. The reality was simpler and more brutal. They fled from a crime scene that had become a trap for them, only to fall into the arms of ruthless nature. They tried to escape, but every step took them further away from the water and closer to death. Now the investigators realized that they were not looking for living people, but for a cemetery scattered over dozens of square miles of wilderness. Mark, Susan, Robert, and Olivia were probably still out there, in the deep shadows of the canyon. Their bodies could have been buried by rockfalls or pulled into inaccessible crevasses by floods. The canyon they had come to conquer swallowed them up one by one, separating them in their last moments. The police expanded the search area by another 5 miles, but hopes of finding the others were becoming more and more dim. The landscape here was so difficult that you could walk 2 steps away from a body without noticing it. However, on October 1st, 2018, while reviewing high-resolution satellite images taken by a private space agency at the request of the families of the disappeared, an analyst noticed an unnatural glow at the bottom of one of the deepest gorges, which the local Indians call Coyote's Mouth. On September 21st, 2018, a thick folder with the criminal case file titled The Carlos Spencer Case was placed on the desk of the Coconino County District Attorney for a final signature. This time, it contained no search plans, satellite imagery, or billing requests. It contained a final opinion that officially rewrote the story of the group's disappearance from a tragic accident to a crime drama with a fatal ending. Carlos Spencer entered the police station only as a pile of paper and physical evidence, but the truth that he took to his grave finally came out. The legal wording of the case closure sounded dry and ruthless. Death as a result of a physical conflict that arose after an attempt to commit a serious crime by the guide. The investigation recognized that the actions of the tourists who struck Spencer with the fatal stone were an act of necessary defense. They were not murderers. They were victims who, in a state of affect, fought for their lives against a man they had trusted. This conclusion had catastrophic consequences for the one person for whom this horrific plan was likely designed. Elena Spencer, the sister of the deceased guide, received official notices from 3 insurance companies. They categorically refused to pay compensation, the total amount of which was $1,500,000. The lawyers referred to a standard contractual clause that voided any payments if the insured person's death occurred during the commission of an intentional crime. The money that was supposed to save her from a serious illness disappeared along with her brother's reputation. The woman was left alone with her diagnosis and the terrible realization of what her brother had done and how many lives he had destroyed for the sake of a phantom salvation. For the Daniels, Hayes, and Clark families, this day was a day of final, deafening loss. They received answers to the painful questions of who is to blame and how did this happen. But the most important question, where are they now, remained unanswered. Except for the body of 18-year-old Danny, found in a dry ravine, the canyon gave no one else. Mark, Susan, Robert, and Olivia remained part of this majestic and indifferent landscape. Investigators assumed that after fleeing the crime scene, the group split up or died together, trying to find a way out of the maze without water or equipment. Their bodies could have been buried by rockfalls, dragged by sand during seasonal winds, or hidden in deep caves where the sun never sets. Funeral ceremonies in Ohio and California were held over empty coffins. Olivia Clark's parents erected a memorial sign on the edge of the plateau, but even that did not bring relief. The thought that their loved ones died in fear, running from danger, became a burden that time cannot erase. Today, Carlos Spencer's story has become a dark, cautionary tale of the Grand Canyon. At the Yavapai Point observation deck, which offers one of the most breathtaking views of the Colorado River, you can sometimes see experienced guides taking their groups away from the noisy crowd of tourists. As the sun begins to set and the shadows in the canyon become as thick as ink, they tell the story. They talk about the impeccable guide, who decided he knew these rocks well enough to use them as a weapon of crime. They talk about how the majesty of nature was stronger than human cunning and greed. Carlos Spencer tried to use the remote Eagle's Shadow Canyon to hide his victims and get money, but the ancient plateau decided otherwise. It took the criminal himself, leaving his bones as evidence, and gave his victims eternal rest in its bowels, safely hiding them from the world of the living. This story serves as a cruel reminder for everyone who looks into the abyss from the observation deck. Here, among millions of years of geological history, there is no room for lies. As the old rangers say, the Grand Canyon hides nothing. It puts everything on display, from the oldest fossils to the human essence. It doesn't hide anything. It only takes what it considers to be its own. Some names and details in this story have been changed for the purpose of anonymity and confidentiality. Not all photos were taken at the scene.